Mrs. Tyler recognised, finally, the faint nervous feeling that was tagging her. It was the way she felt when she was irrevocably connected with something dangerously out of control. This is Shirley Jackson, and this line is from her subtly disquieting short story, Of Course. It's a tale that shines a light on the dark reality lurking beneath domestic pleasantries, one that makes you wonder what your neighbours really get up to behind closed doors. Jackson published, of course, in The Lottery and Other Stories, a collection of vignettes that showcase her disturbingly particular brand of domestic horror. Before we get stuck in, I'd like to welcome you to the second series of Tales by Candlelight, this time featuring the work of Shirley Jackson. I'll read you 3 stories, then treat you to a little close reading that explores the sadistic, sad and strange goings-on in Jackson's nightmarish suburbanity. This format gives you time to have a think about the stories yourself, and please let me know your analyses in the comments or join us on the Discord for a more in-depth discussion. And of course, make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the other stories and my professional analysis of Jackson's unsettling vignettes of domestic discordance. So, sit back, relax, lock the door and bar the windows, or close your eyes and put those headphones in while I read to you our second unnerving story in the series, Of Course. Mrs. Tyler, in the middle of a busy morning, was far too polite to go out on the front porch and stare, but she saw no reason for avoiding the windows. When her vacuuming or her dishwashing or even the upstairs bed-making took her near a window on the south side of the house, she would lift the curtain slightly, or edge to one side and stir the shade. All she could see, actually, was the moving van in front of the house, and various small activities going on between the movers. The furniture, what she could see of it, looked fine. Mrs. Tyler finished the beds and came downstairs to start lunch, and in the short space of time it took her to get from the front bedroom window to the kitchen window, a taxi had stopped in front of the house next door, and a small boy was dancing up and down on the sidewalk. Mrs. Tyler estimated him, about 4 probably, unless he was small for his age, about right for her youngest girl. She turned her attention to the woman who was getting out of the taxi, and was further reassured. A nice-looking tan suit, a little worn and perhaps a little too light in colour for moving day, but nicely cut, and Mrs. Tyler nodded appreciatively over the carrot she was scraping. Nice people, obviously. Carol, Mrs. Tyler's youngest, was leaning on the fence in front of the Tyler house, watching the little boy next door. When the little boy stopped dancing up and down, Carol said, "Hi." The little boy looked up, took a step backward and said, "Hi." His mother looked at Carol, at the Tyler house, and down at her son. Then she said, "Oh, hello there," to Carol. Mrs. Tyler smiled in the kitchen. Then, on a sudden impulse, she dried her hands on a paper towel, took off her apron, and went to the front door. "Carol," she called lightly. "Carol, dear." Carol turned around, still leaning on the fence. "What?" she said uncooperatively. "Oh, hello," Mrs. Tyler said to the lady still standing on the sidewalk next to the little boy. "I heard Carol talking to someone." "The children were making friends," the lady said shyly. Mrs. Tyler came down the steps to stand near Carol at the fence. "Are you our new neighbour?" "If we ever get moved in," the lady said. She laughed. "Moving day," she said expressively. "I know." "Our name's Tyler," Mrs. Tyler said. "This is Carol." "Our name's Harris," the lady said. "This is James Jr." "Say hello to James," Mrs. Tyler said. "And you say hello to Carol," Mrs. Harris said. Carol shut her mouth obstinately, and the little boy edged behind his mother. Both ladies laughed. "Ugh, children," one of them said, and the other said, "Isn't it the way?" Then Mrs. Tyler said, gesturing at the moving van and the 2 men moving in and out with chairs and tables and beds and lamps, "Heavens, isn't it terrible?" Mrs. Harris sighed. "I think I'll just go crazy." "Is there anything we can do to help?" Mrs. Tyler asked. She smiled down at James. "Perhaps James would like to spend the afternoon with us." "That would be a relief," Mrs. Harris agreed. She twisted around to look at James behind her. "Would you like to play with Carol this afternoon, honey?" James shook his head mutely, and Mrs. Tyler said to him brightly, "Carol's 2 older sisters just might take her to the movies, James. You'd like that, wouldn't you?" "I'm afraid not," Mrs. Harris said flatly. "James does not go to movies." "Oh, well, of course," Mrs. Tyler said. "Lots of mothers don't, of course, but when a child has 2 older... It isn't that," Mrs. Harris said. "We do not go to movies, any of us." Mrs. Tyler quickly registered the any as meaning there was probably a Mr. Harris somewhere around, and then her mind snapped back and she said blankly, "Don't go to movies?" "Mr. Harris," Mrs. Harris said carefully, "feels that movies are intellectually retarding. We do not go to movies." "Naturally," Mrs. Tyler said. "Well, I'm sure Carol wouldn't mind staying home this afternoon. She'd love to play with James." "Mr. Harris," she added cautiously, "wouldn't object to a sandbox?" "I want to go to the movies," Carol said. Mrs. Tyler spoke quickly. "Why don't you and James come over and rest at our house for a while? You've probably been running around all morning." Mrs. Harris hesitated, watching the movers. "Thank you," she said finally. With James following along behind her, she came through the Tyler's gate, and Mrs. Tyler said, "If we sit in the garden out back, we can still keep an eye on your movers." She gave Carol a small push. "Show James the sandbox, dear," she said firmly. Carol took James sullenly by the hand and led him over to the sandbox. "See," she said, and went back to kick the fence pickets deliberately. Mrs. Tyler sat Mrs. Harris in one of the garden chairs and went over and found a shovel for James to dig with. "Oh, it certainly feels good to sit down," Mrs. Harris said. She sighed. "Sometimes I feel that moving is the most terrible thing I have to do." "You were lucky to get that house," Mrs. Tyler said, and Mrs. Harris nodded. "We'll be glad to get nice neighbours," Mrs. Tyler went on. "There's something so nice about congenial people right next door. I'll be running over to borrow cups of sugar," she finished roguishly. "I certainly hope you will," Mrs. Harris said. "We had such disagreeable people next door to us in our old house. Small things, you know, and they do irritate you so." Mrs. Tyler sighed sympathetically. "The radio, for instance," Mrs. Harris continued. "All day long and so loud." Mrs. Tyler caught her breath for a minute. "You must be sure and tell us if ours is ever too loud." "Mr. Harris cannot bear the radio," Mrs. Harris said. "We do not own one, of course." "Oh, of course," Mrs. Tyler said. "No radio." Mrs. Harris looked at her and laughed uncomfortably. "You'll be thinking my husband is crazy." "Of course not," Mrs. Tyler said. "After all, lots of people don't like radios. My oldest nephew, now, he's just the other way. Well," Mrs. Harris said, "newspapers too." Mrs. Tyler recognised finally the faint, nervous feeling that was tagging her. It was the way she felt when she was irrevocably connected with something dangerously out of control. Her car, for instance, on an icy street, or the time on Virginia's roller skates. Mrs. Harris was staring absent-mindedly at the movers going in and out, and she was saying, "It isn't as though we hadn't ever seen a newspaper. Not like the movies at all. Mr. Harris just feels that the newspapers are a mass degradation of taste. You really never need to read a newspaper, you know," she said, looking around anxiously at Mrs. Tyler. "I've never read anything but and we took the New Republic for a number of years," Mrs. Harris said. "When we were first married, of course, before James was born." "What is your husband's business?" Mrs. Tyler asked timidly. Mrs. Harris lifted her head proudly. "He's a scholar," she said. "He writes monographs." Mrs. Tyler opened her mouth to speak, but Mrs. Harris leaned over and put her hand out and said, "It's terribly hard for people to understand the desire for a really peaceful life." "What?" Mrs. Tyler said. "What does your husband do for relaxation?" "He reads plays," Mrs. Harris said. She looked doubtfully over at James. "Pre-Elizabethan, of course." "Oh, of course," Mrs. Tyler said, and looked nervously at James, who was shoveling sand into a pail. "People are really very unkind," Mrs. Harris said. "Those people I was telling you about next door. It wasn't only the radio, you see. 3 times they deliberately left their New York Times on our doorstep. Once James nearly got it." "Good Lord," Mrs. Tyler said. She stood up. "Carol," she called emphatically. "Don't go away. It's nearly time for lunch, dear." "Well," Mrs. Harris said, "I must go and see if the movers have done anything right." Feeling as though she had been rude, Mrs. Tyler said, "Where is Mr. Harris now?" "Oh, at his mother's," Mrs. Harris said. "He always stays there when we move." "Of course," Mrs. Tyler said, feeling as though she had been saying nothing else all morning. "They don't turn on the radio while he's there," Mrs. Harris explained. Of course," Mrs. Tyler said. Mrs. Harris held out her hand, and Mrs. Tyler took it. "I do so hope we'll be friends," Mrs. Harris said. "As you said, it means such a lot to have really thoughtful neighbours, And we've been so unlucky. Of course, Mrs. Tyler said, and then came back to herself abruptly. Perhaps one evening soon we can get together for a game of bridge. She saw Mrs. Harris's face and said, No. Well, anyway, we must all get together some evening soon. They both laughed. It does sound silly, doesn't it? Mrs. Harris said. Thanks so much for all your kindness this morning. Anything we can do, Mrs. Tyler said, if you want to send James over this afternoon. Perhaps I shall, Mrs. Harris said, if you really don't mind. Of course, Mrs. Tyler said. Carol, dear! With her arm around Carol, she walked out to the front of the house and stood watching Mrs. Harris and James go into their house. They both stopped in the doorway and waved, and Mrs. Tyler and Carol waved back. Can't I go to the movies? Carol said. Please, Mother. I'll go with you, dear, Mrs. Tyler said. Not yet thoroughly unsettled? Listen to my reading of Jackson's menacing story, The Renegade, by clicking here next.